So thanks very much for coming on. You're obviously ex-2nd Battalion, 7th Battalion?
Yeah, 7th Battalion. What was obviously after much whinging and moaning and crying and fighting. Yeah, the amalgamation of the 5th and 2nd Battalion in 2012, 2013, yeah.
And you're out now, what, 5 years?
So I'm out now, so I left in summer of 2016.
Okay.
So what am I coming up on? 7 years out, which has flown, really has.
And do you miss it?
I'd say my answer is probably going to be exactly the same as most people's. It's like there's certain aspects you miss and then there's other aspects you don't miss. Like you obviously miss the camaraderie, which is you cannot replace anywhere. I think everybody's aware of that.
Yeah, definitely not.
But it's definitely 3 AM sitting in a hut or sitting beside a tree in the mountains. Wouldn't miss that now.
No, definitely not part of my naps.
No, exactly.
Definitely my downfall. Grand, and so you went in, there's different routes obviously, you can go into the Defence Forces. You went in as a cadet. And what was that journey like?
So I suppose it was, just to sort of give a little bit of additional context. Yeah. So, I was sitting in university, I was out in UCD, as an undergrad, and like most undergrads, towards the end of 2nd year, I had this terrifying realization that reality was going to actually bite in less than in a year, basically. So I was like, okay, this is a problem. Additionally, what was a problem was I didn't know what I wanted to do as much as what I didn't want to do. Okay. And I was like, I'm not ready to sit in an office and be in a suit and tie and pretend that I know anything. So one of my best friends from school had gone into the cadet school after school, straight out of school.
Oh, okay.
So he had been in there, if you can imagine, for 2 years. He was just about getting commissioned. And I remember approaching him and saying, what's the story with this army situation, and do you think I'd be able for it? And in fairness to him, he actually said to me, I have thought that you would be a good fit. Okay. So walked into there was a jobs office on campus. Yeah. Went in, there was a cadet school application form. So there was the cadet school application forms, the Army General Recruitment application forms. I knew the cadetship because my mate had done it. Yeah. Picked it up, filled it in, and then that was it. Oh. So the difference being, and this, this might connect to something else we might talk about, is, I then went in as a college graduate into the cadet school system because the Defence Forces had started to lean more towards trying to bring in graduates as opposed to school leavers into the cadetship. Having said that, out of a class of 50, there was only maybe 7 or 8 of us, maybe 9 that were graduates, so it was still predominantly school leavers.
Oh, okay. And out of like how many started you guys and how many finished? Like what was the attrition?
It was I'm not too sure. I'm assuming the system is very similar now, right? So you arrive down into the Curragh, alongside your naval service and Air Corps cadets. The naval service, they just need to learn how to march and fire a rifle, and then they head off down to Hull Bowland to complete their training. That was the system anyway back in 2003. And then the Air Corps stay with you until, let's say, the end of the first 7 months, because they have to be competent up to the level of a section commander, from a sort of an army tactical perspective. Yeah. And then they head off and actually do their really difficult training then in Baldonnel, where the attrition rates are much higher, because obviously, like, let's be honest, I was an infantry officer, so I call out, it wasn't exactly, you know what I mean? It was more roaring and shouting a lot of the times, but I'm sort of joking. So then we continued on for 21 months, and then it was eventually scaled back to 15, I think, after us.
Yeah, I think it's up to around 18 now at the moment.
Yeah, and it's sort of like it changes over the years. So funnily enough, I went in as a cadet, and very early on, as much grief as it was, particularly in the early stages, after about a year or so, I said, God, wouldn't mind coming back here to work as an instructor. Even the instructors thought was insane. They were like, why would you want to come back here? I was like, no, I find it sort of an interesting place. So when we were in there for 21 months, the idea then being, 21 months is kind of a long stint to try and convince somebody who's a college graduate who could be going into a grad program in a company or whatever. Yeah. So how do we entice them in? Well, let's maybe shorten it, and they cut out certain bits of training that they felt, does a newly commissioned lieutenant really need to know, infantry lights up, so certain types of weaponry. They said, no, we can let the brigades or whatever do that. So it was scaled down, and then I don't know what was added into it since. Okay. To finish it off, like when I was an instructor for 3 years, it was a 15-month cadetship. and it was predominantly graduates who were in those classes.
Yeah, so you were there for 2 classes, right?
Oh, as an instructor,
yeah.
You actually, funnily enough, I actually spanned 5 classes, but like obviously for some of them, you're getting the tail end of one class, so in reality, you're there for you would have actually been involved in the cadets training really for 3 of those classes, 1 for an entire end to end. God love them, they would have had you for an whole stint.
You first served in Monaghan, did you? Like when you came out of cadet school?
Yeah, so the army actually, I can't really talk about the naval service in the Air Corps because the Air Corps is obviously completely based in Baldown. The army was funny. There was sort of and I knew this going in because I had my friends who were in already. Yeah. They were able to say to me, "You're from Dublin." Like I'm from Clondalkin in Dublin, and the lads were going, "You can't get based in Dublin. Just be aware of that." And I kind of went, "Right, Gran, that's the system." So I was like, "So where's kind of the closest I could get to home?" And they said to me, "This is the 27th Battalion, which was in Dundalk at the time." Oh, yeah. So of course, again, I had a few mates up there. So I was kind of going, "Sure, that's only it's an hour up the road." Yeah. So I went up to Dundalk thinking I was going to have a great life in Dundalk. I was going to be having a crack in Dundalk town during the weeks. Everything was very nice. And then within maybe 2 months, I was taken aside by one of the senior officers in the battalion. And he said to me, "Listen," he said, "we need somebody a little bit more mature to send over to Monaghan. So we're going to send you over to Monaghan." I was like, Monaghan was not on the cards. So I ended up spending 3 years in Monaghan.
Jeez. And you would have lived in there, right, for like Monday to Friday?
Oh, absolutely. So I was, there was basically me, there was no sergeants living in it. That's it. Me, a few privates, maybe a corporal or 2, and that was it. So it was essentially a company post. So in sort of civilian speak, there was only around 120 to 150 people in total meant to be there. Yeah. So it was me, a commandant, 1 captain, and then all the troops.
Pretty small camp.
Yeah.
And then you've done a few trips overseas. So first time in Kosovo, was it?
Yeah. So funnily enough, went to Kosovo in 2008, and then if we think about the wider historical situation at the time, the economy collapsed while we were over in Kosovo. So we were looking at home, more worried about what was going on at home than we were really on a day-to-day basis in Kosovo at times. Yeah. But of course, and then Monaghan as a barracks was actually, it wasn't just shut, it was shut down and due to be sold while we were in Kosovo. So I actually had a situation where I had a platoon of lads, most of whom had come from the unit, who I then had to interview all of them to say, "Where do you want to go home and work when you go home?" Because that barracks is gone. So that was a very sort of, in some ways, it was an interesting thing to have to deal with as like as one of my mates says, I was never a young lieutenant, I was always an old lieutenant. Like as a 27-year-old lieutenant, like you're facing off against, sergeants who had 15 whatever years service, your corporals could be likewise, and your troops who you've probably trained or worked with. They're sitting across the table from you going, "The barracks is gone." And I'm going, "Yeah, I didn't see this coming either." Yeah. And then I had to ask them, "Where do you want to work when you go home?" And that sort of opened my eyes to the wider reality of who made decisions about the Defence Forces and how swiftly these things can impact you. Because there was a similar story happened in my next overseas deployment, which was to Uganda.
Yeah, how's that?
So Uganda was a funny mission because the European Union had decided that they wanted to send people over to train troops for the Somali transitional federal government. So we went over to do that, and likewise, while I was in Uganda, I got a text from friends at home with a link to the then Minister for Defence's website saying the Defence Forces was being downsized from 3 brigades to 2.
Yeah, that's right.
So I almost was kind of thinking, was I jinxing things? Was I leaving the country and then the Defence Forces were getting eviscerated while I was away? So that obviously was the big one, because at that stage I was a lieutenant on the verge of becoming a captain. Obviously, I won't go over old news, but all of our promotions had been delayed because of the financial crisis, so I was a very old lieutenant at that stage. And I was kind of going, okay, this is now very big. And it started to get me to sort of think, where does this organisation fit in the grand scheme of things and what's going on? Yeah, and that's how you ended up in second battalion, was it? So then, so that's, I then had sort of said, I want to go home to Dublin because, family, friends. I went home to the 5th Battalion, but I went home to a 5th Battalion that was quite literally boxing things up to go across the river, to go to Callbrew Barracks to become the 7th Battalion. And then it was from the 7th Battalion. Was it from the 7th Battalion that I went?
Yeah,
it was.
7th Battalion, and you went
Yeah.
to
Western Sahara.
Western Sahara as
Yeah.
a military observer. What's a military observer do in Western Sahara?
So, without boring everybody to tears with the type. So, so there's lots of stuff in the news nowadays about the Ireland and its triple lock system, right?
Yeah.
I'm not really interested in the triple lock system. I'm not interested in talking about that. What is interesting for people to understand is the sort of the chapters, as we call them. So you can deploy under Chapter 5, Chapter 6, or Chapter 7. My first deployment to Kosovo was under Chapter 7, which is peace enforcement. To put that in the easiest layman terms, if you see two fellas are about to fight each other, you're allowed to use force to stop them, right? Whereas Chapter 6, peacekeeping, the two of them can start fighting, you just write it in your notebook, and then you write a report back to the lads. But if you're directly attacked, then you can respond with force as per your rules of engagement. Then there's Chapter 5, which when I describe this to my family, not only do you not intervene in anything, you don't even have a weapon, which I personally found actually more stressful than I expected it to be. Sitting in a place and really your protection is your blue beret, and you're going around and really if your mandate is to go in and check to see does somebody have a weapon, and if your liaison person who's with you says we're not going in today, you're going, all right, fair enough, we'll just go home. So
that's all you can really do.
Yeah.
And then was it from there then that you started to leave, or you moved into the EU battle group and then kind of moved on?
So what happened to me then? So came home 2015. It was interesting when I came home from that deployment. I had really started to see the velocity that sort of not just officers, senior NCOs were now in the mix, because in order for them to get promotion, they were going to have to take spots around the country. Senior officers up to Lieutenant Colonel were getting pings, sort of saying, well, you're in a job this week, but actually no, now we need you to go and do this other job. I was likewise. I went into a brigade job and in Colbrew Barracks, and within 2 weeks I had a senior officer come into me to say, actually, we need you to go in to do the military commander job in Portlaoise Prison. To which I then said, well, you must really be stuck if you're asking one of your staff captains from brigade to go in. He said, yeah, we just don't have the people. So when I went in there, then straight from Portlaoise I went onto the battle group. But if I'm being totally honest, my decision to then sort of say, okay, I need to move on, wasn't necessarily just because, yes, in the immediate term, I was looking at how quickly fellas were moving around and everything just seemed to be kind of falling apart, if I'm being honest. But if I go back to 2003, I had friends in the DF, in the Defence Forces. I knew before I went in that going in as a graduate, my age was probably going to be against me. So it was always in the back of my mind that once I got to that 12-year stage, I was probably going to look going elsewhere, and it's sort of the decision sort of half made itself for me. So I did then move.
Was that the thought process then in leaving, like everything that was going wrong in the Defence Forces, the length of time it's taken to get promoted, that you just decided to start looking outside? Or?
Well, I suppose I would have been a little bit unusual, and friends of mine sort of thought I sort of took the wrong approach, but I was like, very early on, I was pretty open about the fact. I said, no, I said, I'm going to look at how I am in 12 years. If I think I can make a go with this and I want to go all the way, I will. But I'll start planning. And then after around the 7-8 year mark, I was like, I think after the 12 years, I will make a move. It just so happened that coincidentally, things started to really ramp up and get a little bit crazy. So, if things had been going hunky-dory, I probably still would have moved on. Because I think it was time. I think there's also a piece as well about, I was grand in the army, but like, was I basically being the best officer that I could be at the time? I was very, very conscious of my position from a leadership perspective. And if I thought that I wasn't being the best sort of leader and manager, particularly for troops, I was like, maybe it's time for me to go and do something else.
That's fair. And then, what was the first job then when you kind of moved on from the Defence Forces?
So, funnily enough, I'm a huge fan of, and I often say this to people who are doing anything now in life. Before you go looking at jobs, you go looking at anything. Look at your own network. And I did that. So I went to a family member of mine and I said, listen, I think it's time to move. And he said to me, he said, right. He said the reason I went to him is because he had only ever worked in the private sector, so it was a completely different perspective. And he said, right, he says, go and talk to a good friend of his, and he says, get him to give you a job. I was like,
Okay,
it's a bit intense. So I hopped in my suit, hopped in my car, and went out to talk to this friend of his. And the friend of his looked at my CV, and he basically said, looking at your CV, how you were trained, your understanding of process, all these sort of things. Yeah. Did you ever consider management consulting? I burst out laughing. Okay. And I kind of went, how on earth could anybody take me seriously telling them to do anything? And he said, no. He says, it's not so much what you've done, which he said to me, you just don't know how to sort of communicate and articulate what it is you've done. But he said, it's how you were trained. He says, I can read it here. He said, so do you want me to get you a chat with the head of consulting for KPMG? Oh. So I was like, yeah, that sounds pretty good. So within days, I found myself in front of the boss in KPMG, who, I actually can't thank enough at the time. I haven't spoken to him in advance, so I won't name him, but you know who he is if he ever sees this. So I sat down with him, and it was brilliant because he effectively, in that first conversation, said to me, he said, I see it. I can see how your experience and training is relevant to us. He said, I just need to figure out what grade we bring you in at. He said, because yes, you've no industry or consulting experience, but he said, you've probably got more management experience than most of the people on the floor out there. He said, so leave that with me and we can talk. Long story short, I ended up in a job in KPMG as a management consultant within about a month. I actually got that offer just before getting on the plane to go to the EU Battery Group exercise out in Strasbourg. So that's where I started, was in KPMG management consulting, and that's largely the industry I've stayed in since.
How did you find that kind of transition from soldier to civilian? Like, what was the process for you as an officer?
So yeah, in some ways, absolutely mental, because first of all, there's the language thing, right? Yeah. So you're jumping into a world that has its own way of talking, all these sort of things. There are a couple of other things which are kind of interesting in that, my first overseas deployment, as you would know, let's say even forget about overseas, right? I went into a unit, you're a lieutenant or you're a commissioned officer, you don't really know anything, right? Let's be honest, right? So, it's all of the troops basically teaching you how what you've been taught in theory is applied in reality, and then you come to that nice equilibrium. But if you think about it, I was in my mid-20s where I was actually responsible for 30 people, then very much responsible for 30 plus people in Kosovo. That was when I was 27. Yeah. And then by the time I left the Defence Forces, I was the adjutant for a unit of 400 plus people. Yeah. So you're operating at a particular scale. Then you jump across to the private sector, and all of a sudden, you could be responsible for no one except yourself. And then you could be getting hammered on, let's say, in the private sector, like small deliverables. It's a report for this, or it's an Excel model for that. So your whole world of kind of going, all right, okay, I have to do this, but then also I'm not responsible for anyone. So it took a while there was a kind of a mind shift that was required, which has become far clearer to me now, at the position I'm at now in work versus when I started,
Yeah, I think the difference in the military life and kind of private sector is that in the military you're paid for the job that you're prepared to do, let's say, whereas in private sector you're paid to be effective and perform and make money for the business essentially. And so it's a massive mindset shift.
Oh yeah, exactly. In the most brutal form, as it was said to me, from a private sector perspective, are you a net earning asset? Yeah. And if the answer to that no, well then you need to figure that out pretty quickly.
Move on. And then after that, then you were back away then with the United Nations.
Yeah. So
how did that go? How did that come?
The crazy mother of God. So I'm sitting. So I was actually in KPMG at the time, working away, and then a former really good friend and former colleague of mine. Actually, there was a few of the lads actually were out working with the United Nations Mine Action Service. Yeah. Down in Somalia. So I'd worked obviously with the European Union with that on that Somali mission. So the whole Somali situation was quite familiar to me. Okay. So they contacted me and said, listen, we need to set up a new office to help us support not just the African Union but also the Somali government in basically dealing with the explosive hazard threat.
Okay.
Fancy word for IEDs, right? As part of an insurgency. So I said to my family, I was like, listen, there's a really interesting role down in Somalia, and everything was fine, because let's be honest, people don't really they go, Somalia, right? They kind of go, I think I heard of what's going on there, but people don't really know. Yeah. Everything was hunky dory. Got everything organised, and about a week before I went to go down to Somalia, there was an absolutely enormous vehicle-borne IED initiated or exploded in the city centre, and it was the biggest vehicle-borne IED ever at that stage. And then, of course, my family kind of piped up and went, "Is this the same place you're going to?" I was like, no, don't worry, it's miles away. So went out and did that for a year, and to be honest, like that was, it was brilliant. As you know yourself, you were kind of back in that UNE world, and you were kind of going, there's bits of this now I could, take or leave. But the work itself in that team, it was amazing. But then after the year was done, what I had set out to do, that office was sort of set up. It was sort of humming, and then I just sort of said, right, I'm going to give my family a break now. I'm going to come home, and through my, like I said earlier on, using the network, I was actually, funnily enough, I had been contacted by another member of the DF who wanted to know about getting a job in consulting.
Oh, okay.
While I was putting him on to a senior person who I had known in KPMG, who's now working in EY, I said, listen, can you chat to this fella? He's looking to get into consulting. And during that conversation, that individual said to me, grand, but also when you're coming home, give me your CV. And I said, funny you mentioned that. Here is my CV, because I'll be home pretty sharpish. And then I ended up coming home and joining EY.
You've been there for like 4.5 years?
So I've been there, I've been working there for, 2018, so just about 4.5 years, So, from the outside, and I totally appreciate this, people would have the idea that, the Big Four refers to accounting, right?
Yeah.
Accountancy firms. Fine, PwC, Deloitte, EY, and KPMG, that's grand.
Yeah.
I'm not an accountant, not a qualified accountant. I've never, I have been audited, but I've never done an audit, right? So I found myself in the technology consulting part
of the branches of
of UI, and I've been doing that for 4.5 years. So funnily enough, a little bit different to what I was doing in KPMG, not hugely, but and I've been working. I won't go into the names of clients, but I've been working predominantly in the utility space, and it's just one of the things I'll say about, not to go off on a tangent about consulting, but particularly coming out of the army world is, you can come out and you can jump into a particular industry, right? Let's say you come out and you work for a soft drink company. Your brain will then get totally molded into producing the product and that operation, whatever, getting out. Going into the consulting world is quite interesting, because not only are you exposed to, like I've been exposed to, banking, digital transformation, payments, regulatory programs, and then massive technology change programs for utility. Okay. And then also, as you go up the ranks a little bit within that firm, you also then have to understand, well, how do you also run a consulting business? And how do you deal with that, the people issues, the business development, all that sort of stuff. So it's almost like your brain has to learn how to run a business on one hand, but then also how to learn new industries every time you interact with them. So it's, from that perspective, it's brilliant to sort of really broaden your understanding of most things.
And did your program manager in EY?
So even within sort of the technology world, you can imagine, like, friends of mine even laugh at me about, they're kind of going, you have technology? And I'm going, no, hold on now a second. I'm going, yes, we're going to have the lads who will like code and be able to do machine learning. We'll have the people who can talk to a client about cloud architecture, SAP, testing, whatever. I sit in that team where it's very much the large project and program management. So it's when the client sort of knows what they want to do, you kind of go, right, well, how do we write the strategy to get this done? How do we break it up? How do we manage it? And what's the governance around it? And let's get rolling, and then we'll help you manage the delivery. yeah.
So it's seeing that kind of strategy and formulation all the way through to implementation.
Oh, absolutely, and then as well,
everything that goes in between.
Yeah, absolutely, and then absolutely everything goes in between. So like, you know, if there's cyber stuff is required, if you need to bring in a data fella to sort of say, oh, here's the GDPR constraints around that sort of stuff, you have all of that, and you can dip in and out as required, and that's really what. But yeah, what's great is it gets you to understand all of the end-to-end process of pretty much anything, which actually kind of means then you're a very good, boring business dinner party guest, because you can pretty much talk to somebody from any industry and kind of go, oh, what's going on with you guys? And that's it.
Yeah. And in terms of, have you hired like many ex-army people yourself, or like I know you mentioned you spoke to one guy?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say even within, let's say, the current place we're in, you know, at one stage we had, I think we were up to 5 or 6 ex-DF. That doesn't include ex-forces from other places. So you have a couple of UK lads, a couple of lads from parts of Europe. And then also as well, within these firms, you also have this military networks.
Yeah.
And obviously not just within Ireland, within the UK, within Europe, all this sort of stuff. And then what's sort of interesting is, you know, you'll also know then who's in the other firms that are also in your industry. That's fine. So you'll kind of go, oh yeah, you're going for a job in that place. Such and such is working there, and you can touch base with them. And then as things widen, you're then aware of, well, which there could be an ex-sergeant or an ex working in one of your clients, which I have at the minute. You could be pinging somebody on the internal mail saying, I didn't know you were working here. So yeah, it's quite interesting.
Have you noticed there's any differences between, you know, someone that doesn't have military experience and someone that does when you're working with them in a professional environment?
Yes, and it took me a while it took me a long time, like years of encountering certain things and trying to figure out what it was that I didn't get or that I was missing about things. And eventually I've gotten to the stage now where the military is kind of funny, and whether you're trained in the cadet school or whether you're trained in a recruit platoon in a depot or whatever, you know, there's a couple of fundamentals. And one of those fundamentals is the military gets you to understand what it means to be a small part of something that is operating at scale, right? So if I just explain this purely from a private sector perspective. So oftentimes within a private sector perspective, you sort of say, okay, we can do this small piece, but like, can we scale this up? As in, can we make this bigger? Can we have it sort of automated so that we're not doing a whole lot of manual stuff and we can be big or small? If you think back to when you start even training in the military, if you think back to it, it's like, yeah, you might be a rifleman, but it's ingrained into you at the very start. Yeah, you're one person, but you'll always be part of at least a 9 to 10 person team, which in the private sector is a cross-functional team. Yeah. And then that team is part of a wider team, which is part of this whole other structure. So what I find funny is you have that, as a military person, you have it in the back of your mind the whole time. When you're interacting with everything, you're like, okay, we're going to go and do this new thing, or we're doing something. But what does that look like at scale? Within what framework are we trying to do this? And I find sometimes if I chat to the ex-army lads, you can click back into that conversation very, very quickly. Yeah. Whereas if it hasn't been ingrained in somebody, I find sometimes you have to slow down to say, okay, we're doing this bit now. And then eventually you kind of go, okay, well, what framework are we doing that within? Under, you know, the auspices of what? As part of whose plan, whose vision? So yeah, that's sort of the vision plan, how that plan relates to you, the tasks you have is very much a military thing, and you definitely click into it. And funnily enough, it doesn't matter even if it's other Irish lads. I interact an awful lot with the lads in the UK, and it's the same thing. That the conversation is much faster and it's much leaner. Yeah. That's just
that's the difference, anyway. And then in terms of like different like military associations and things like that you're involved in, your ARPO, is it?
Yeah. So in the Irish context, we're kind of, in the Irish context, it's funny, we talk about being slow to sort of change and all these sort of things, and I'm talking about just all of us, just even from an organisational perspective with the associations. But like when I look back to in 2019, I think we ran a small event which was like a military transition talk thing, right? Okay. And on foot of that, then I got involved in the Association of Retired Commissioned Officers, ARCO, which is like a recognised, you know, body of it. And originally, why did it come about? It came about with a sort of an intent to sort of safeguard sort of pension provisions and all that sort of stuff. Okay. But that organisation sort of said, well, actually, maybe we should also be doing sort of networking and engagement within sort of the wider security and defence sort of space.
Yeah.
But what I've noticed is, right, we're doing that, and it's great, and I can go into a little bit as well from a personal perspective, why that's actually been, I've actually found it quite valuable. But also as well, you have like, IUNVA, the Irish United Nations Veterans Association, you have ONE, so the Organisation of National Ex-Servicemen and Women, or ex-service personnel. Like, it's a brilliant organisation that, they're doing a colossal amount for, veterans in need, homelessness, as a registered charity.
Yeah.
And then you have other organisations as well, the likes of the Irish Defence Forces Officers Club, which is very much kind of a club which is brought together by Xers who wanted to sort of say, well, like, we have a network here, why aren't we talking? But what's interesting to actually look at is, even from 4 years ago, like the level of professionalism and organisation that you would see in the likes of ONE, we're in the ARCO space, like, we're also trying to take into account that, somebody who's doing 40-year service who retires as a colonel or a general, that's a very different type of person than the likes of me, who left as a captain. Or somebody who's now on the new pension system, who's basically leaving after X amount of years, who's going to spend more time in different employments than being in the army. And there's a fair bit of sort of, we talk to each other as well.
Yeah, which is good. And do you think like that, those outside bodies could be doing more for, let's say, like the younger vets that now are leaving, or even they're doing too much already?
No, absolutely. And that's very much something that we're quite literally right now we're trying to tackle, even down to the level of, like, later on this evening, I'm going to be going to the pre-retirement course in one of the Defence Forces installations, because we sort of said, well, it's all well and good, ARCO go in, the guys are great, right? I'm not just saying that because they're all retired generals, but I sort of reached out to the president and I said, like, I'll make myself available for that. I said, because we need to get that voice in there to talk about the fellas who've left that little bit younger, or not even younger, but earlier, who now need to embark on a new career. So we're very much aware of, that what we have to do, we have to engage with those more junior veterans who are going out to new employment. It's figuring out how to do that best that we're in the middle of trying to figure out now.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of, like, yourself, you just moved jobs.
Yeah.
UCD. So that's a new adventure for you?
Yeah. So I jokingly said to my friends, so I'm going back. I'm going to be moving from consulting into kind of the wider educational sort of space to UCD. I've joked to my friends saying I'm going to get the tweed jacket and leather elbow patches on. But I'm not going to be lecturing. I'm not doing research. It's actually specifically to work within the Innovation Academy, which, it's actually quite interesting, harking back to my, being an instructor in the cadet school, which was actually which is a third level institution itself. I've always been really interested in that space, but also, without going off on a massive tangent, I think also as well from an Irish perspective, where we are and sort of owning our own sort of, new concepts, new businesses, new design, and empowering sort of young people to sort of have that entrepreneurial mindset. The universities have recognised that we need to start basically building up on that, and that's really where I'll be working. Yeah,
so you could have a guy that would be on like a computer science degree maybe, or a program, and he could kind of go work in your department with an idea and put in kind of formulation and get the funding and everything else.
Yeah, so it's sort of it's sort of split into three sort of broad strands. There's still you're still doing your bread and butter stuff of, there are courses you can go online, you can look what they are, sort of like, and like design thinking, which which is something that people can sometimes think is sort of a term that seems a little bit sort of, you don't really know what it means. It's going back to my days in consulting, people would have heard of agile development. So instead of just sort of saying, we are going to build a blue box that has a red button on it, you sort of say, well, what's the user's problem? What's the market's problem? What's the market's pain? Okay. And how do we design something in order to deal with that pain? And it's looking at design and producing, and it could be in any industry, it could be in healthcare, education, whatever it is. So you'll run courses on that vein, but then also there's proof of concept labs where you can prototype things, you can talk it through, and any students can go in from the campus and say, I have an idea, and they'll sit down with that team. And then there's also a strand as well where small startups might actually get going on campus, and then seeing, can we keep them on campus, that sort of stuff. So
yeah. And how long do you think it will take before you kind of get your first startup off the ground? Or I think UCD might already have a program in place.
So you have to remember now there's slightly different areas. So you have like the likes of UCD Nova and these other places that will actually, let's say, if they think something is viable to go to market, they might go to market. But we'll be very much more in that educational space, and remembering as well that we're going to be teaming up with Technical University Dublin. So it's even that is really, really interesting to me, is the idea of, I'm a UCD graduate, but I was like, wow, it's actually pretty interesting. So we're going to be teaming up with another group to actually get this done, and to sort of see, well, how do we sort of scale up, to use the term again, sort of this design thinking sort of approach. Okay.
Brilliant. And I suppose, how important then do you think education is for someone in the Defence Forces then looking to kind of make that move outside, do you think?
It's funny, about maybe, let's say 10 years ago, right? Just pick a number. About 10 years ago, there was a trend. There was a trend amongst guys about 10 years ago to go off and do an MBA, right? Yeah. So, I don't know how much an MBA cost people back then. Was it 20 grand, 30 grand? I can't remember, right? So, that was popular at the time.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, right, so go off and do an MBA. And funnily enough, I actually, as part of my own prep for getting out, I remember going over to London, and one of the big 4 consulting firms, one I haven't worked for, so you have a 50% chance of figuring out which one it was. They had a really, it was brilliant actually, they had a full panel of ex-military talking to a room full of active service military about the transition to civilian life, and in particular for that company. And the question kept coming up from the floor, what do you think about fellas doing an MBA? Should I do an MBA? And then eventually, I think there was an ex-like Lieutenant Colonel or something. He was sitting in the middle, and he just kind of went, right, stop asking us about the MBA. And he bluntly just sort of said to the room, he said, there's no silver bullet educational accreditation that you're going to get that's going to make you immediately hireable to us. He said, in addition, he said, you going off to do an MBA to learn the theory about a business of which you have no practical experience is not really of much value to me. Now, I was kind of going, that was pretty blunt, but I thought the message was quite interesting.
Yeah.
So anytime I've given guidance or advice to various guys who are, let's say, in the process of leaving, they've sort of said to me, should I do this? I have also been asked, should I go off and do an MBA? And I've said to guys, it was like, well, just hold your horses for a second.
Yeah.
It's like, understand what industry or workplace it is you want to go into, and sort of really get to understand what specific skills or accreditations does that particular industry need you to have. So for example, in the consulting world, I know, because I'm now at a level where, when you look at let's say major programs or what's going on with clients, you'd sort of say, okay, so we know that they need, a project manager who's going to fit into this team. So we know, for example, that we can't even give in a CV if it doesn't have Prince 2 on it, right? Okay. Likewise, we're not going to try and put somebody onto a project who's going to be doing Scrum Master or Agile delivery or Scaled Agile, which is like a new way of doing project program delivery. We're not going to do that if the person isn't at least Scrum Master qualified, Product Owner qualified, or Scaled Agile framework qualified. Likewise, your cloud architects, your Microsoft people. So I sort of say to people, no. Understand what you need to add to your CV to get your CV in the door.
Yeah.
And that just requires a little bit of research.
Yeah, definitely. And that was my next question then. So what advice would you give someone leaving? Well, I think that's really nice.
Yeah, so again, it's actually funny, right? So, and that's why I was sort of saying, I find it interesting. I've now been long enough out that I can look at the different theories and approaches places have. And, I actually think back to how we are trained from a like the combat estimate and how you go about planning.
Yeah.
And I actually often think it's funny. It's like, well, the first thing you always have to do is you don't ask about yourself, you ask about what's the market, basically.
Yeah.
What's the reality of the environment you're going to go into, what are the obstacles, what are the constraints, all that sort of stuff, and then you plan accordingly. And like that, if I was going to go and work in, let's say for example there was an investment bank and I kind of go, I don't have a finance degree. You go, no, hold on a second. What within the investment bank is it you want to do? Are you going in to work for their cyber team? Do you have any cyber qualifications? Are you going to go work in their product house? Are you Scrum qualified? Do you have a product owner thing? But it could be anything. You could be supply chain management, any of these sort of things, blockchain. So it really is do the research, get the name of somebody. Like, we're not that many steps away from somebody who's within any organisation, really.
Sure.
I often say to lads within the military network, doesn't matter where they are, whether it's ARCO, ONE, or if it's just somebody who's a member of no organisation but gets me through LinkedIn, I'll be like, right, what is it you want to do? This happens a lot. I said, what is it you want to do, Grant? And then I said, let me have a think about it. I'll have a look at my own network and go, talk to such and such. I'll let him know you're going to talk to him. Ask him if you were to be successful, because they call it hygiene screens. Okay. If I pick up a CV, if there's key things on the CV that I need that I don't see on it, then you're goosed.
Yeah, and the likes of the Prince 2 I was at, that'd be like a short 5-day course.
Well, yeah.
I know there's different.
Yeah, so you can get your foot in the door, right, with the likes of the foundation level, which like realistically you can study that in a couple of days on your own. You do the multiple choice exam. Then practitioner, I think, might take you a week. Again, it can cost a couple of euros, but like, I did it specifically to sort of say, yeah. And the funny thing is, some people might disagree with me on this one, but like, I actually have, as sad as it sounds, I've actually got the Prince 2 manual behind me. Because, and I still have all the post notes on it, and it's more so because, like, I'll be pretty blunt about this. Yeah. When a client hires the likes of us to go in, we're not cheap, right? No. Like, a client doesn't deserve to be paying for your time, and you're not basically utilising, or you're not at least advising the best way of doing a thing. Yeah. So, whether it's how to structure documents, how to approach sort of projects and programs, I'll refer to that a lot of the time. So for me anyway, it's I think it's a good one to have, and I do advise anybody who's coming into the consulting world, definitely just get it done so you understand what people are talking about when they're talking about major program delivery.
Yeah, brilliant. I think that wraps it up.
Yeah.
Brilliant.